All right, welcome back, everybody. Happy Friday evening. Here we are. And I will ask online, I guess, Xiaotia, I'm looking at you again. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. And I'm assuming you can also see me as long as the camera's in the right place. Okay. Welcome back to COM 407, Interactive and Emerging Technologies. Thanks, everyone, for being here as we're about 2/3 of the way through the term now. Believe it or not, it seems like we just started yesterday. And there was a spate of announcements for you to pay attention to. And those of you who like to laugh at me for my stupidity, there's a funny thing. I kept bugging Group 16. Where's your PowerPoint presentation? Where are your questions? Group 16, Group 16. Only to realize there is nobody in Group 16. So I was barking into empty space online for a while. Fair enough. Again, here's what we're going to do today. I tried to change it up a little bit last week by having the presentations first. And also by trying to insert some interactive activities, which did not work very well at all. We're not going to do another word search today, and there's only 2 presentations today. So I'm going to actually do what I've done in the past. I'm going to begin with my presentation, and then we will get to those 2 important student presentations. Again, I encourage you, if you're not presenting, to pay close attention, because for your final written assignment, which is a significant grade, you know, the more awareness you have of other readings, the better informed your writing is going to be. You know, if you have 3 items in your bibliography, that's not acceptable. If you have 15, that's probably too many, but having 5 or 6 is good. And one of the advantages of paying close attention to the presentations of other students is they've all been assigned, as you know, a particular reading. And so with close attention to the presentations, you can actually save yourself reading anything except your own week of material, because the presentations have actually been content strong. And what I mean by that is the groups have done a fairly good job of covering the most important details of each reading. So there's real value in paying close attention. Of course, I did post to the announcements and then to you via email the class rules that have we've become a little bit lax on our cooperative communication strategies, and so I just wanted to reiterate those rules. Not the least of which is it's very discouraging for me when I'm giving a presentation and I'm looking out over a sea of students who are, you know, playing bubble pop or something. So anyways, so this is what we're going to do today. I'll start with my presentation, and then we'll get to the student presentations. And I have attempted again. Oh, and so the debate questions that I attempted to get us involved in with QR codes last week, and nobody seemed to really get involved with it, either online or in the classroom. I did notice yesterday when I went back into the platform and I was working through it that a number of people actually did go on and contributed to the debate, not in any sort of real time interactively in class, but it was nice to see that some people did. I have a couple of those again for today based on, I think, Group 14's questions, but we'll see how well that works. So important to today's topic is the way, so actually we need to review just a little bit. We didn't get through much of my presentation last week, and that's okay. But I do need to review some of that material. So in our class last week, we started looking at the idea of hacktivism. Hacktivism, which is obviously a portmanteau of activism and hacking. You know, with its root, it has roots in the cyber libertarian aspects of the internet. Hacktivism, it began as a movement for the freedom of information online, part of the larger movement that's come to be known now as net neutrality, the argument surrounding net neutrality. And quite simply, hacktivism means to disrupt internet channels of activity that are considered politically offensive by whichever group is doing the hacking, by digitally compromising. So what these groups will do is they'll digitally compromise an organization's security protocols. They'll hack the security protocols of a military organization or some corporation, and often the hacking can be quite damaging. I mean, we've all heard about some of these global viruses that have been installed that have actually shut down entire economies for brief periods of time. They can be quite malicious, but some hacking is only political on the surface. Its purpose is simply to disrupt the security protocols, to let the corporation or large organization that is in offense know, and of course to hope that it gets media coverage so that the wide world knows that their security protocols were hacked, they were compromised. And sometimes all they do is they put a little quiz on it that they have to access, a little escape room type quiz. Some of the installations are not very malicious at all. They're quite trivial, but the whole purpose is to demonstrate to the world that security protocols have been compromised. And this term, hacktivism, it was coined ostensibly in 1996 by this group called the Cult of the Dead Cow. And important, again, to today's topic is the way that part of their campaign was intended to protect users from surveillance and invasion of their privacy. So between 2015 and today, the issue of corporate consolidation, the issue of media, corporate media consolidation in particular, has come into sharp relief. The power and dominance of Facebook and Google in particular is startling. And in China, with its own huge global population, even just nationally, of course, it has its own massive media corporations that have concentration of power and control. So one of them is Baidu, if I'm saying it correctly. Is that right? Baidu or Baidu or however you say that. That's Baidu. That's one of the big ones. But Tencent is a huge corporation. These huge Chinese corporations, maybe 3 or 4 of them, that are common parlance. We're all familiar with them. Hugely powerful in the corporate media landscape. And protest against such power, empowerment, and participation are still actually at the forefront of media studies in terms of political economy, which tends to be the dominant scholarly tradition in media studies. Of course, protest against this degree of power and how it's being used remains a central focus. And if you did the readings for this week, you'll be acutely aware of what I'm talking about. All of them really talk about how and why these large corporations are harvesting our private digital data. And, of course, because it's political economy, they tend to take this sort of alarmist perspective. It's always bad, right? They give it this long list of reasons we should be afraid. In fact, one of the articles, which was really just a short interview, is called Be Afraid. It says be afraid because, and they give good reasons, because some of the malfeasance in the use of this information is things that we should be concerned about. But what they don't look at significantly is the economy side. There was one really interesting article about how people should have proprietorship. They should have ownership of their digital data. Just like we have ownership of our own labor, just like we have ownership of our own iPhone, we should have ownership of our digital data, which currently we do not have. And one of the problems this article points out is that the terms of service that you get when you join WeChat or when you join Facebook, for example, are prohibitively long to read. Has anyone ever read, honestly, put your hand up because I would like to know, the person that has the time to do this, has anyone ever read all of the terms of service for any of the games or... No, right? It's a running joke. I've seen some of these college humor videos where they're signing up for a new thing and it says terms of service and he's like agreed or accept, right? He just verbally says it and they just skip past it. And this article suggests that this is an intentional strategy by these corporations to have these massive, untenable, impossible to read terms of service so that people just scroll to the bottom, hit accept, and they basically have ownership of every bit of data that exists about you for all time, in all eternity. Long after we're all dead, Facebook Corporation will still own us. It'll own us as living entities. With this, the idea of surveillance, but the other side of it, what I was getting to, the other side of it is, of course, the economy. As these media corporations, now largely converged, as they switched, we talked about the crisis of journalism being only one media production format, and how, advertising really underwrote, financially underpinned the large media corporations in the 20th century. And as the audience commodity fragmented and scattered onto the internet, these companies found themselves scrambling to figure out, well, how can we make money? And basically, they moved from selling an audience commodity, 10,000 viewers or 100,000 viewers, or for the Super Bowl, for example, 6 million or 60 million viewers at once, to selling data about users. So not a group, not an aggregate of viewers, but rather a data set of users. And so without being able to promise an advertiser like Coca-Cola Corporation, for example, that they would have 10,000 viewers on Wednesday night at 6 p.m., what they could do is say, on our website, on Facebook, I will have this week 500,000 unique visitors who are all male, between the ages of 18 and 25, and who have all bought sporting equipment in the last month. And so a company like Nike, or perhaps Coca-Cola, would say, I will give you money to have our logo flash on your webpage because that demographic meets my advertising needs, right? But in order to do that, they have to harvest our private information as users in order to be able to say, okay, these are the characteristics of these unique users. So for most people, the internet and the new media are associated with a host of positive developments as they represent technological progress. And we've talked about the problem with that term, progress. Technological progress, one of the most central characteristics of modernity, signals improvements of almost all aspects of life and entails the promise of the more just and equitable distribution of wealth and power. There was all of this discourse when the internet, especially at the early emergence of Web 2.0, there was a lot of conversation in the cybersphere about how this would democratize the world, how everyone would have a voice, how there would be a new diversity of political perspectives available in the media landscape now that everyone was a user. Everyone was able to generate content so readily, which of course didn't happen. Quite the opposite happened. In fact, in order for these companies to maintain reasonable returns, they had to concentrate, they had to converge, because they were bleeding advertising dollars because of the switch to digital. And so the only way to really create the types of profits they needed to maintain corporate tenability was to basically just buy every competing business, either horizontally, which is competition, or vertically, which was up and down the flow of distribution. And this resulted in corporate concentration, where we then have these huge corporations that literally control all of the information in competition hardly with 2 or 3 other giant corporations. And this view of technological progress that we all bathe in, we all bask in the convenience of the smartphone, we all luxuriate in the entertainment of never having to sit on the toilet or ride an elevator without having a quick game to play, or a text message to respond to, or someone to chat with, or a meme to laugh about. Never a moment of boredom, never an instant of inconvenience, never a time when we can't communicate almost immediately with anybody anywhere on the planet about anything we want. And so we all look at this new techno communication utopia without looking significantly. And one of the readings, again, pointed out, why don't we look at those? Because Facebook, for example, it's in Facebook's interests to tell us about how great and convenient and wonderful all of its platform is, and then hidden beneath it, what we don't see as users are things like shadow profiles and the sale of our information and significant invasion of privacy. the one comment that the interviewee made that I just thought was great is that he says Facebook actually, or Google, he said, Google actually knows me better than my wife. Nobody lies to a search engine, he said. I thought that was pretty funny. Not to say that people lie to their husband or wife, but I lie to mine all the time. She doesn't even know I'm here. So this view, which can be called, has come to be called actually techno-optimism. Techno-optimism is very widespread in society. And public money goes into technological innovation and the spread of technologies among people. But in fact, as we know from some of the theory we've already looked at in the course, technology is actually much more ambiguous. It's not all techno-optimism. It's not all rosy new conveniences. You know, the dark side are often things that remain invisible to us as individual users. Some examples include huge waste, physical detritus that is shipped offshore, often sunk into the ocean or sent to less developed countries to deal with. Simply the silicon footprint of creating so many smartphones leaves an incredible amount of waste, simple garbage, right? Pollutants on a global scale. That's one of the sort of invisible elements that we don't see. And another one of them is this perhaps malfeasance of our private information. Did I hit it? So surveillance, and significantly also self-surveillance, and what Mark Andrejevic calls lateral surveillance, so sort of surveilling each other, even unintentionally, have now become an inextricable part of modern governance. Globally, governments are involved deeply, deeply in bed with these massive media conglomerates, harvesting information often for reasons that would be considered inappropriate, and oftentimes, in certain examples, outright illegal, but no one's doing anything about it. And it is true, as we know, that without surveillance, the work of governing bodies and bureaucracies, corporate bureaucracies, and media companies just trying to generate profit would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. Which is interesting. It's hard to believe, right? Because 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we had massive governments surveilling its population without the convenience of the internet, without the digital footprint, without everyone above a certain economic digital divide carrying their phone around with them. But it is inarguable that in the 21st century, under the economic and socio-political circumstances that we live today, which are different from 40 years ago, that governance of the global population, or even just nationalist populations, certainly populations the size of, for example, China's, would be utterly impossible without the assistance of digital media footprints. But surveillance introduces new divisions, new social divisions, new ways of classifying people, and new ways of dealing with their behavior. And in so doing, new symbolic meanings are generated alongside new modes of control and often new modes of punishment. For example, a class distinction that we did not have 40 years ago is those who are walking around staring at their iPhone and those who are not. And you don't have to be very observant, even in this area. As I walk back every night to the R&D apartments, everyone's holding an iPhone, often staring at it, often dangerously staring at it as they ride their scooters down looking at the map. But there's a few people that aren't. If you look carefully, you can see them, and frequently those people are serving food, operating a cash register, sweeping the street. And so this becomes a new class distinction, and that's what is meant by this. It creates this whole new digital world in which we live, actually creates new ways of classifying people, and, as a political economist would observe, new ways of controlling and often of punishing them. In short, new forms of power are made possible, and this power is, as we know, concentrated in the hands of those who collect and control surveillance data. So the idea of surveillance It's not new, certainly, new forms of it under the conditions of digital reality. But you may have been exposed in the past to Michel Foucault, who was a French post-structuralist theorist, a political economist, and a cultural studies theorist, who used the example of the panopticon. The panopticon. Now, the panopticon was actually never built, but it was designed by a sociologist named Jeremy Bentham. In theory, it was designed. An imaginary machine designed in 1791 by Bentham, who was a British architect, and of course he was a legal reformer. And this contraption, which you can see an image of here, sort of, and next to it, that handsome fellow is not Uncle Fester, that is Michel Foucault. This contraption allowed for the total and complete surveillance of prison inmates, who quite literally inhabited a transparent world with no place to hide. So the design of it, as you can see, this is a cross section. I don't know if you can see, the picture's not very big because of the way I have the slide small, but you'll be able to look at this slide later as I upload it to the Learning Mall. But basically, it's a circular room and a dome. And all around this circular room, on several floors, are prison cells. And right in the middle is the guard tower. And the guard tower would actually have tinted glass. And this gave rise to two forms of surveillance. One, the inmates always felt like they were being watched. So unlike a standard prison, which tends to be built on a grid, there's no corner to go around. Every cell is open-faced to the guard tower at all times. You can imagine how invasive that would feel when you need to use the bathroom, for example. Right? But this was the design of this machine. Never built, but it was imagined. And the second layer of surveillance is prisoners who were trying to curry favor with the authorities within the prison could report to the prison guards on what they saw, because all the prisoners in the circle are also always watching each other at all times. So everyone's watching everyone at all times. But most importantly is the guard tower in the center. And with tinted glass, the guard tower did not even have to be manned. The guard tower didn't even have to have a guard in it. It could have a guard in it 1 hour or 3 hours out of any given day. As long as the prisoners didn't know when the guard was there, there was always a risk that the guard might be there. And so they self-surveilled. They would self-discipline. They would not engage in any sort of activity that would have been considered inappropriate because they're worried they could be being watched at all times. That's the panopticon. And the logic behind this machine, as Foucault tells us, is that prisoners were aware of their complete and total visibility at all times. And so they would regulate their own behavior, knowing that any wrongdoing would be caught. Now, in the era of popular 20th century legacy media, so before the crisis of journalism we looked at last class, before the digital came into play, rather than discipline, social theorist Zygmunt Bauman in 1999, he argues that the mechanism is seduction. So we can see elements of the media big brother eye watching us, but it's not quite the same. Under our free choices of media, it becomes seduction rather than discipline. It introduced the stakes through televised broadcasts of celebrities and then create new fantasies and new desires. So the late 20th century and 1950s in North America, for example, were replete with media representations that sort of presented this utopian, upscale life that may have a lot to do with what we've looked at in the past as society of the spectacle. So this panopticon is thus turned into a synopticon, in which it seduces people into watching, and it seduces people into emulating a certain normative lifestyle, a certain consumerist and very highly normative lifestyle. Specifically, synopticon, which is a term coined by Thomas Matthiessen in 1997, is taken to refer to a new technique of power, exemplified by the mass media in which people are themselves turned into watchers. So they're not being watched, they are now the watchers as well. The many watch the few. So in the panopticon, the few watch the many. But under the synopticon, the many watch the few. And the many are seduced by the few in terms of their glamorous lifestyles, etc. I think the Kardashians may be one of the global greatest examples of the many being seduced by the few. I mean, their whole online presence is obviously titillating and sexualized. You know, beauty products are just the legitimate surface of the way they present themselves, half naked all the time, and really famous for being famous. Really famous for being rich and famous. This is what we mean by the seduction of the synopticon. And people are absolutely mesmerized by them and then try to emulate their beauty, their fame, their physical presence, their social capital, things like that. So the many watch the few. But these few tend to be the global elites, movie stars and celebrities, politicians, star academics, in short, those in power, and those whose statements are carefully repeated, and altogether they convey a total consumerist way of life that is subsequently admired as the only or the most worthy way of life. Bauman's argument is that this technique of power, which is implemented by the mass media, legitimizes the current state of inequality through giving the impression of transparency and equivalent. It's the old myth of the American dream. You know, under the conditions of free market consumerism, with hard work, you can rise to the top as well, which of course it proves to be absolutely false in the 21st century. It's simply not how things work. At the same time, this synopticon, it stifles any dissenting voices by propagating a certain lifestyle to be emulated and endorsed in a bid to ensure conformity. And you don't have to try hard. If you were to post in a social media platform anything negative about the Kardashians, you would have a certain number of people that joined the conversation in chorus with you, celebrating your criticism of them. But you would be absolutely inundated with negative, often verbally violent rejections of your rejection of the Kardashians, absolutely normalizing and defending them. So while the panopticon was designed for prisoners, today's surveillance society has extended its function to society as a whole. So not just prisoners, this is actually everybody is in the media net now through the normal operations and mechanisms of the internet. And the new media have introduced a new dynamic in which the many watch the many now. So phase 2 of the 20th century was the synopticon, and now we're in this new phase where the many watch the many. So with the panopticon, the few watch the many. And with the synopticon, the many watch the few, and they're seduced. And in this new era, now we have the many watch the many through the popularization of the new media and associated techniques of surveillance, including digital web cameras, but also Google Earth, following people's accounts on Twitter, Facebook, and the like, and through search engines and mobile phones, we can collect information on other people, and they can collect information on us, even informally. On some level, your WeChat group of friends or your Facebook or whatever a similar social media site you might be involved with is literally a digital collection of your friends' photos, their activities, their posts, their interests. You literally have an encyclopedia of your friends online owned by Facebook. And this creates, it actually fosters to a certain degree suspicion. And you would be hard-pressed not to have read the readings for this week and not have felt a certain significant sense of suspicion underpinning the perspective of every one of those authors. The idea of information being collected to each one of them is absolutely horrifying. And I just don't think it's that horrifying, but they certainly think it is. And the reason this information is collected is part of it is social, but part of it is fostered by suspicion. And again, you don't have to search far. You don't have to go very far on the internet to find some news-oriented platform. I use Yahoo for email, for example, and when I bring up Yahoo before I can access my email, there's all sorts of news. And because Yahoo, like many media outlets, is desperate to produce new journalism 24 hours a day, again, the most trivial nonsense that trickles in from anybody. My neighbor's dog vomited up a rabbit. And there's video of it, right? And that becomes the story of the day. So everyone is watching everyone for the opportunity to have 5 minutes of fame. And suspicion is further generated through things like online scams, identity theft, and the very sensationalist journalism that keeps these in the public imagination. So the need for journalism to have a story about something, anything, means that, again, as viewers, we get inundated with information. The percentage of people that are suffering from things like identity theft is so small. It's negligible. It's the point at which it's not really news. But as soon as one person has their identity stolen, there was a movie called Identity Theft. Just today, I received an email from someone suggesting to me that due to families being separated because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I had been selected at random to be amongst a group of global individuals to receive 150,000 American dollars in order to help me overcome the economic difficulties. Now that sounds like good news. That sounds like good news. And I'm tempted to hit the link that says, all you have to do is tell us everything about yourself and your family and name your firstborn child after us, and we will give you $150,000. And not many of us are fooled by this anymore. But clearly enough of us are, because the industries exist, and this generates, like I said, suspicion. It's so easy to create one of those emails and send them to 1 million people, literally in a keystroke. It's the easiest scam on earth. So even if only 10 people are fooled by it, your day's work is done. Good money. And the upshot, the through line here is that we more than welcome. So once we become too suspicious, that we welcome surveillance. We welcome attempts to police these environments. And we're prepared to submit to methods of surveillance for our own protection. Right? So Facebook ends up telling us, no, we need to collect all this information just in case someone tries to steal your identity, we'll be able to protect you. But what they don't say is, and we're also going to sell all this information about you to every advertiser that we can. And any government and any police agency that might think you're a bad person, we're going to sell it to them as well, as quickly as we can. And in fact, we may try to make you look like a bad person so that we can sell your information to these industries. There's much recent, astonishing actually, research on how easy it is to learn so much about a person, even a person who is not even online, by indirectly triangulating them to determine information through the media ecology of their friends. So this idea of exodus, this idea of you don't like it, don't participate, it's just an empty platitude. There's no logic in that. If you choose not to have any social media presence whatsoever, but you do choose to have friends, you have 8 friends, you even cut it down, I'm only going to have 8 friends in the world, but all 8 of them have Facebook, and they mention you once a month. Your name comes up, a picture of you appears in their feed because you were at the same party they were at, or a discussion of who they're inviting to their Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner, and your name is on the list. And without even having an online presence, you can be triangulated. And what we learn from some of the readings is you can be triangulated to within a very narrow margin of very specific details. Your address, your age, your gender, your sexual orientation, who you may or may not be having a romantic relationship with, when your dog died. Unbelievable bits of data that can be determined about you. In the 20th century, we used to talk about parts of the earth as a good place to hide. And that metaphor was put in place in order to suggest we can go here and sort of fall off the grid, off the media grid, off the grid of our social insurance numbers, off the economic grid. But what we've come to discover is that in the 21st century, there's no place to hide. Simply being offline does not mean you don't have a digital footprint. It means it's indirect, but it still exists. There's also the issue of potentially unwanted and intrusive commercial exploitation of the information that's collected. Information is not only used for purposes of classification and social control, but it's also sought, sold, and otherwise capitalized upon. As I've explained, this is the model of advertising. Social media companies like Facebook and Twitter are making money by selling analytics. So they used to sell the audience commodity, as I've explained, but now they sell analytics, demographic information combined with user online behaviors, which they collect on the basis of what their users disclose and how they move within these applications. So again, not only the demographics, the age, perhaps the ethnicity, perhaps the gender of a person, but also they purchased shoes in the last week. They've purchased 12 toothbrushes on a monthly basis in the last year. These are the behaviors. They've clicked on these 3 sporting institutions. They never surf porn. All of these data that give us information about our behaviors. And what's worrying here is that until recently, surveillance techniques were controlled by governments. At least governments to some degree are elected or chosen or trusted, right? Which, whatever their failings, at least represent the broader public and act on its behalf. Corporations do not have that motive. And corporations have proven again and again and again to be unscrupulous in the way that they will capitalize on your information without any concern for the ethics of how it may affect your private life or your home life or your very freedom. Now surveillance techniques have become the property of private companies who operate for profit. More and more control and power is ceded to these big corporations, leaving less space for the public, the non-commercial, and the common to operate freely. So again, it just becomes the norm. More broadly, the main points of the debate, of this whole debate that I've been trying to introduce to you, the main points include these. 1, the concern over the extent to which any government should be allowed to have access to private communications. 2, the data trail that people leave as they communicate online, not only about themselves, but about other people who may be even more vulnerable, including, for example, small children. I'm often amazed at my circle of Facebook friends, many of whom are parents, who almost religiously post photos of their kids. Some of them quite attractive young people. And with 8 photos, I could probably get a schedule of the parks and schools they go to without much visual information. And you can imagine somebody who is a little bit more predatorial might use that information for more insidious reasons. And the third issue of the debate comes down to who stores, who owns, and who has access to this trail of data. And one of the interesting things about one of the readings this week is that it shows that scholars, I think one of the points of that one really long, boring one with all of the technical mathematical data was to show that universities without much money can actually do this. We can figure it out. We can triangulate these people. That's one of the things that the article tells us without telling us that. It demonstrates it to us. But the other article is quite explicit in saying that, one of the problems with COVID is that it's hard to track people digitally because a lot of people don't want to give up their information. But if people had propriety, ownership over their own digital information, it would solve the problem. Because nobody would have any sort of reason to want to protect their information under the understanding that as soon as the pandemic had been brought under control, they would then have ownership again of their data. It wouldn't be able to be sold or misused. In June 2013, whistleblower Edward Snowden, he revealed the extent of the surveillance being undertaken by the U.S. National Security Agency, the NSA it's called. And through its PRISM program, providing details of the extensive and illegal surveillance of internet communications, and that the NSA actually has direct access to the servers of Facebook, Google, and Apple. Direct access. The NSA has direct access. This was such a big deal in the news that it's interesting, coming from Canada, which is so closely economically and socially associated with the United States. I was astonished because I was working in the universities in Canada, and immediately all online platforms shut down. All of them shut down, and in order to use any sort of online game like Kahoot or something like that, or even some of the activities we have on the Learning Mall, you had to get students to sign a waiver saying that they were willing to have their information filtered through American servers, because so many of these programs and platforms were actually housed in the United States. So the information, the data trail wasn't staying in Canada, it was actually being processed through the US. And so Canadian students had to agree to allow their information to be processed through things like Twitter, because there was a huge alarm that, okay, so the American government has direct control to Twitter. The NSA justified its actions on the basis of protecting from and preempting future terrorist hits. So this resonates with a couple of ideas we've looked at. You remember we looked at the 5 filters, Herman and Chomsky's 5 filters, before media content, journalism content reaches us. And the last one was ideology. And in the mid-20th century, in the United States, for example, all they had to do was say, oh, the Soviets. You never actually had to criticize the American government. You never actually had to criticize an American corporation, because you always had a scapegoat. And then they said this changed in the 21st century to the new scapegoat of the radical Middle Eastern terrorist. Right? All you had to do is get a picture of somebody who is wearing clothing that is common in one of those countries, walking down a street in New York. You put any headline over it, and it absolutely would take the day. It would win the internet that day. And then the second issue that we've talked about that relates to this idea of the NSA defending its actions, saying we're protecting you, is this very idea of suspicion, right? This idea that, oh, I really want these surveillances in place. I'm not doing anything wrong, and I want to be safe from my horrible neighbors who might be doing something wrong. So please surveil. Send a drone over my house every night. I just want to know that I'm good. And the NSA also used this rationale to justify spying on German Chancellor Angela Merkel, the Mexican leader Enrique Peña Nieto, and Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. And it also spied on Chinese computers. We don't know much about that. But there is a radical piece of media information that the NSA was spying on Chinese computers. Oh, I think it's great. As soon as I said that, like 3 people closed their laptops. It's probably not in here. In thinking of the technical aspects of social media, they're characterized by permanence. You ever deleted your Facebook profile or your similar profile? Has anyone ever deleted their major social media profile? Anyone ever done it? Must be in a new generation. No one's ever deleted their social media profile? Ever said, no, that's it, I'm going off of this for a while? Wow, I'm actually astonished that no one's ever done it. Everyone in my generation has deleted them a couple times. Because you get this attitude like, it's destroying my life. That's it, I'm just going to delete it. But then like 2 weeks later, you're like, I can't live without it. I cannot live without it. So you open up your you go to open up a new profile, and it tells you that, oh, that email address is already in use. What? How can that? Somebody has my email address? So then you punch it through, and lo and behold, all the information you deleted just comes right back. So deleting your profile didn't mean you deleted your profile. It means you cut yourself off from your profile for a while, but Facebook still owns your profile. So that's what we mean by permanence, right? This whole idea of Snapchat. What's the equivalent of Snapchat in China? Snapchat. There's another one. Not WeChat, but Snapchat. I can't remember. But the idea of Snapchat, I remember when My daughter actually introduced me to Snapchat. This is kind of funny. Maybe not. Maybe you won't think it's funny. I thought it was funny. She said to me, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, she's like, Dad, you got to get Snapchat. Oh, yeah? Why do I have to get Snapchat? Well, because you can send pictures to your friends on your phone. My text messaging can do that. Yeah, but these pictures only last a couple of seconds. I said, really? So it can do everything my text messaging can do and less. Doesn't make any sense. What's the value in that? Well, then I can send racy photos and there's no footprint. And then I showed her how quick a screen capture was. Oh, look at that. Permanent record. I'm now going to post this to Facebook, and even if I delete my account, it's there for all eternity. Good thinking. And this is what we mean by this idea of permanence. Once it's out there, it's out there. There's really no way. Again, you've probably seen a news story where it says, this person tweeted something really offensive, and there was huge blowback, and they deleted the tweet right away, but here are 8 screenshots of the tweet that they deleted. You can't hide. Right? There's no way. It's all permanent. And this archival aspect of social media accounts mean that they can act as depositories, of course, of memories, ideas, thoughts, right? Really positive stuff. And Facebook sells this. Their existence, to a degree, actually constrains the person, as archived content potentially remains there forever. And now we're talking about longitudinal stuff. Facebook has been around long enough that things that I did in my 20s can haunt me now because I've been on Facebook long enough. And I'm not proud of some of the things I did in my 20s. And I wasn't savvy enough to think, I'm not going to post this to social media, because what did I care? I was 25. And the kind of information one posts must be carefully considered nowadays, right? You don't want your privacy, you don't want your very conservative boss, for example, or perhaps your uptight university professor to see the same information as your party animal drinker friend, right? Because people are looking at Facebook now when they're considering who they hire, or other similar social media platforms, right? There you go. Technology researcher Kate Rains Goldie refers to this as context collision. When the public face you show to your colleagues or the private face you show to your intimate relationships is exposed to your professional liaisons, or vice versa. And this is a Christmas party I attended a few years ago, only to find myself absolutely dismayed to see it posted on my friend's social media account. To the left of it is my academic profile picture. To the right is my context collision, where that picture ended up showing up on social media. So this is the context collision. In a book on public shaming, John Ronson, he referred to the case of Justine Sacco. I don't know if you've heard this story, Justine Sacco. This person wrote a tweet she thought was funny. She thought the tweet was funny, addressing her 150 or so, she had about 150, maybe 200 Twitter friends in her Twitterverse. And a few hours later, though, because of the open access of Twitter, her tweet had been spread globally, and she was publicly shamed as a racist because she had made some flippant comment about African Americans, something, she didn't really mean anything by it, but systemic racism exists. She probably wasn't a very bad person, but she had made some flippant comment, and it ended up going viral. And this example shows how the navigation between what is private and what is public is becoming increasingly complex. Context collision. And we might not feel very bad. We might not be very sympathetic to Justine. We might think she deserved it. Yeah? She was a racist who was convincing herself she wasn't a racist. She stupidly posted something online and she got caught. I have an autistic son, and because he's autistic, he tends to think digitally. He thinks very, very directly. Not a whole lot gets by him. And certain jokes he likes. And he came to me right after this incident had actually happened, and he said, "Hey, Dad, have you heard? They've developed a new app that detects racism online. It's called Facebook." I thought that was quite funny. And what he means is simply the digital footprint we leave can reveal so much about us. And while we might feel like Justine deserved it, are you sure you've never deserved it? And this is where we have to be careful, right? We've all said stupid things that may have been racist or homophobic or irresponsible, especially after 12 or 18 beers. Andre, I'm talking to you. No, I'm kidding you. And they were stupid. And our friends probably should have called us out for it and said that was a stupid thing to say or that was an ignorant thing to say. But we probably don't deserve to lose our job, have our marriage end, have our children abandon us, right? We probably don't deserve the type of consequences that poor Justine faced. Now, what she did was stupid, but let he who is without sin cast the first stone. We need to be, I think, a little more discriminatory with who it is that we're crucifying online. And when somebody like Justine Sacco, who is so irrelevant to everything on earth, becomes front page news, again, we're back to the 5 filters. But what we're being told to think about instead of thinking about real issues. This young woman made some stupid comment online, and that was trending for 3 days. However, the problem of such surveillance and the accumulation of data about ourselves is one of so-called function creep. Function creep. That data collected for one purpose, such as marketing, might end up being used for a different purpose. That's data creep. So it's being collected to sell our demographic information to an advertiser, but it gets into the hands of somebody that has another purpose for it. Maybe a troll, maybe a blackmailer, something like that. An example could be, you post a video online to your friends of your crazy cross-country biking adventure. You did a little radical X-biking. And your insurance premium suddenly go up. Your life insurance premiums suddenly go up. This is an example of data creep where the insurance company basically trolled your profile, found out you're doing dangerous stuff, and used that as an excuse to raise your insurance premiums. Right? The citizens have to be allowed, though, to pursue their lives at least freely enough. I'm not talking about anarchy. I'm not talking about a world without rules that are reasonable. But, I'd like to be able to, pick my nose in the bathroom occasionally without thinking that's going to be trending on Twitter tomorrow. Right? And while all of this may sound like the work of fiction, particularly if anyone has seen the movie or read Philip K. Dick's The Minority Report, big data generated through generalized surveillance is contributing to preemptive and proactive forms of governance and policing. Now, Minority Report is a sci-fi fantasy where you can actually be charged with murder before you commit the murder. But because the big data surveillance is so good, the predictive technology, in this case it was clairvoyance, but the predictive technology is so strong, they know when and where you're going to commit a murder. So they swoop down on you just before you commit the murder, and you go to prison for murder without anyone being murdered. Convenient, but perhaps a little frightening. And as for the old argument, why should I be worried if I have nothing to hide? Edward Snowden's report in a Reddit Ask Me Anything session in May 2015 actually addresses this. He makes a very good point, arguing that you don't care about the right to privacy because you have nothing to hide is no different, he says, than saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. His point is it misses the bigger point. Most people have nothing to hide, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have the right to hide a little bit. Maybe not everything. No, we shouldn't have the right to hide murder. But maybe I should have the right to hide whether or not I bought sneakers last week. Yeah, that's it. That's my whole presentation. Did you love it? It was impassioned. So we have presentations. My notes say from groups 14, 15, and 16. Group 16's presentation is going to be pretty boring, so we'll probably skip that one. But we do want to hear from 14 and 15. But because we only have 2 groups instead of 3, I guess we can take a break now. I've spoken long enough for an hour. We'll take a 10-minute break right now. When we come back, we'll hear from those 2 groups. before we hopefully conclude a little bit early on this Friday evening. I have dinner plans, so maybe we'll get out a bit early, okay? Take a 10-minute break. Thanks, everyone. Hi. Mm-hmm.
About the two steps, where and does not make sense. I want to.
Sorry, let me see again. My eyes are not as good as yours. So, vague and does not make sense. Okay. Yeah, what was I referring to?
Wait a second, I can.
Can you turn sideways?
I will.
Yeah, that's better. I'm jealous of your visual abilities, which are certainly better than mine. That was embarrassing. You're okay.
This three is the. Can you see it?
2.7?
Yeah.
It's okay. How does controversial topics exist? Okay, so that doesn't make sense. So this is clearly just a second language interference. It's difficult. And one of the things I've often encouraged students to do is to, there's lots of resources on campus, but you know, when you're not saying exactly what you mean, sometimes it's okay. I can figure it out. Oh, I get it. I see. That's not exactly grammatical. But sometimes it just doesn't make sense, right? And so when I see how does controversial, so let me read the context here. In this article, it's the following.
It's about Wikipedia.
Right. Okay. Okay. So how do controversial topics exist? That question actually means how do any controversial topics exist? So you know, if abortion, for example, is how does that exist? Well, it exists because people don't disagree. Or people don't agree, right? That's how. But that's not what you mean. I don't think that wouldn't make sense here. So do you mean how do controversial topics come to get onto Wikipedia, or do you mean how does the information come to have one voice when people might disagree? How do people disagree about controversial topics on Wikipedia? Right? You need to be very clear. What's the question? All of those would make sense. But that one doesn't. And because all of those make sense, I don't know which one you mean.
So I will give details for
Be
this
clear.
topic.
Mean what you say and say what you mean. And I know you tried to do that, right? Clearly that. But in this example, and there's some examples, like I said, where it doesn't matter. Right? The grammar wasn't great because of second language, but I get it. But there's a difference between, okay, I can understand, and too many possibilities, and I can't give you grades. Here, this you didn't get graded for quality. You just got it for what existed, but in the final you will. And I can't give you grades for what I hope you mean. Right? so maybe
if
find
I'm going the wrong direction, so I just want to confirm.
Okay,
If the online is
this looks good. Yeah, I think the topic is good. You're one of the few people dealing with Wikipedia. I think it's worth looking at. I think it's worth exploring. I think your questions are probably good, but I'm not sure because I'm not sure what they mean.
because I'm doing some research on it, how Wikipedia presents the information, the background information, cultures, politics.
See, that's interesting.
Terms. Yeah.
And controversy on Wikipedia, that's a great topic. But you need to know, and not only do you need to know, you need to be able to express clearly to me what the question is, because I think there's lots of great questions. You know, when you take Wikipedia, it's collaborative, right? But controversial topics exist. So how do you get who is it that decided this is what we'll put on Wikipedia? Because it's controversial. That's a great question, but it might not be the question you asked, right? So be very clear. And if you need help, find somebody, find a native English speaker or somebody whose facility is stronger, and explain to them if, for example, you have to explain in Chinese and say, this is what I've written, and my prof says it doesn't make sense. This is what I mean. Can you help me get the sentence right? Because I want to express this question, okay? Yeah. Well, that probably got recorded.